Hello, everyone. Welcome to Right on Campus, Inc. This is Ross Mellman, Editor-in-Chief. Here with me today is Anthony Vultaggio, who was on our last podcast. He's been a contributing writer with us for over a year now. And joining us also today is Stephan Schneider, who's a student at Florida Atlantic University. So thank you both for coming on.
Hello.
Great to be here.
So recently in the news, all we've been seeing and hearing about is this whole North Korea scandal. We recently had the summit with Trump and Kim Jong-un. So before we actually go in and delve into the summit and the politics of it and what we thought about it, I wanted to first ask both of you, what you think is some of the consequences of the rising tensions with North Korea, where this is at, where this has been going, how it's been escalating. What are the stakes at hand?
Well, I think, Ross, it's interesting. The question sounds simple, but it's actually much more complicated than many people think. For example, the whole story with North Korea has basically been the same since the 1960s. It's really all been the same road over and over again, where North Korea, they offer some pretense of peace, they raise the stakes with provocations, they escalate it, and then finally they call for talks and they act reasonable. And while this is all happening, they tend to kind of hit the reset button. But at the same time, the introduction of President Trump, I think, offers an even more complex, for lack of a better word right now, to the whole situation. Right now we are celebrating him for bringing us closer to peace. There have been talks of the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded, but what's remarkable is that just a year to 6 months ago, we had Kim and we had President Trump calling each other Rocket Man.
But then isn't that amazing that it could go from that to getting closer to peace and actually having a summit? What do you think?
I think many people would argue that that red line in the sand and that hard stance was part of the reason why we got to this point. A lot of people have said that, Trump, this has all happened and look at history, it keeps repeating itself. But we haven't had a president like Trump approach this. We haven't had a president like Trump have that fiery rhetoric. And although I'm not sure what the intentions of the regime are, of the North Korean regime, I do think that there was progress if we were going to ever have progress. Because even if we didn't have progress, it definitely wouldn't look like this. It would just keep getting worse and worse. So for that bridge to be there, I think the summit was the bridge, although I am skeptical on certain parts of. I'm not a fan of celebrating things too early. I'm not a fan of that.
Do you think then that Trump's rhetoric, was part of the reason that Kim Jong-un wanted to come to the table? Or do you think that hardline stance?
I think we need to, before getting to the rhetoric of Trump, I do think we need to perhaps we should talk about the history of North Korea to really see the context of what's going on, because as President Trump has noted, no previous U.S. president has gotten to this point. Now, as Anthony's brought up, and what he's basically alluding to is that while this summit is indeed historic, noteworthy, as of yet, it really the question of is it a success really cannot be answered.
It's definitely too early.
It's very early, and if you look at, look at the fact that, over 25 years, longer than, Ross, I think longer than you've been born.
Yes.
25 years of us pretty much, pressing repeat on this, on these talks, and then something happens, and then we're back to square one, and then we're actually at -5.
Do you think it's a fair comparison, though? Because they haven't met a U.S. president before. I mean, this seems to be a little bit of a step further beyond that previous reset.
You mean leader to leader haven't met?
Yeah, and the significance of it.
I don't know how significant that is. It's not just me playing devil's advocate. I don't know how significant it is that they got into a room. Maybe there's a personal relationship being forged, and maybe they'll have an affinity for each other. Who knows? But I don't know that in itself is a major success. I think it's a stepping stone and it may be a pathway to success, but I don't know that we can. I think we can all agree that if everything ends at this summit, everything goes back to normal, it wasn't a success.
Yeah.
But it may be something on the way to success.
So I think it's interesting if you look at this from an academic view of international relations, and you look at particularly the realist view, and you examine what are the individual goals that world leaders are aiming towards. I think it's interesting if you sort of analyze what has North Korea been after for all these years.
So what do you think the main thing is?
Well,
Survival?
I would say it's survival, definitely. They are a very, very small fish in a very big pond, and they've sought to give themselves a voice. And it's interesting because if you see the recurring trends of what they go for, you see that they've basically put all of their eggs in one basket, and that has been nuclear proliferation.
Yep.
Basically, they say like, hey, you know what? We are going to get our seat at the table. We will have some form of respect if we are able to successfully deliver a nuclear warhead to our enemies. And they've gotten to the point where, I mean, a lot of people, like let's be real here, Kim Jong, the Kim dynasty, North Korean government they are one of the worst human rights violators in history.
So do you think that Trump's tough stance of threatening them with war has kind of made them backtrack from the goal of nuclear proliferation as their form of survival, or not yet?
I wouldn't put it on Trump's rhetoric. What I would put it more at is looking at the ultimate goal, which is, I mean, first off, we have to see, and we're going to be talking about this later in the podcast as we actually look at the agreement and look at the definition of denuclearization, which is what they signed in their statement. But I mean, what I have to wonder is, why would Kim Jong Un actually go through with Trump's definition? Because let's be clear, they have very different definitions.
I don't agree with that.
Denuclearization. I mean, that's partly why the summit kind of got a little bit knocked off. What was it in May, and then eventually it was back on.
So do you think that they have different understandings of denuclearization? Or
I haven't heard any different understanding of denuclearization. If anything, that would have come up during the meeting, during the summit. Now, I know they're kind of coy and they haven't really, Trump has always maintained that he's not going to put everything out and certain things. So I don't know if this is due to that of not having the information, but I don't necessarily agree that they don't have the same definition. I think that would have come up, and I don't know, going to your question that you asked Stephan here about whether his hard line it may have been a contributing factor. I don't know that it was the sole factor. Just like anything else, there's levels. And
I think there was differing in his tackle of it compared to Bill Clinton, because under that administration, they had really offered unfreezing funds and allowing North Korea access to multiple facets of the economy in terms of giving them back certain amounts of money for denuclearization, whereas Trump kind of hasn't put things like that on the table or hasn't really gone through that avenue.
That is true, but if you again look at the ultimate goals, and ultimately what it is the reason why I'm so pessimistic of North Korea's actual commitment to denuclearization, which actually I'd like to quote here National Security Advisor John Bolton. He's been quoted as saying that for him, denuclearization is actually an immediate surrender of all its nuclear arsenal and equipment, in which it will basically simply pack them up and ship them to Oak Ridge. Now, let's be clear here. This is a big ask. So much so that President Trump has actually been on record of saying that this could be an unrealistic demand.
I think so. Bolton's a strict guy.
It's
But isn't
very
that even, didn't Trump, I mean, going based off an interview that I saw with Trump, he said it's just not physically possible to just do that immediately. There's scientifically steps that need to be taken. I'm not an expert.
not just the scientific steps, but let's also look at. I mean, basically, they're saying like let's wave a magic wand and poof, all work has been.
I don't think they said that.
Well, I mean, basically,
They said within Trump's first term. That's,
well, what they
that's
want
the
ultimately
target
though
goal.
is they want North Korea to not have the ability to renege and to step things back up, which I interpret that as basically like having their scientists just completely lose all the knowledge and experience of how to build it. But you can't
It's
really.
impossible.
Yeah, it's
I
impossible to
don't
do that.
put-
So,
impossible.
I mean, what's for me, the back of my mind, and this is kind of going on a. Like we have no idea if it's going to happen or not. But
Yeah.
what's to stop the North Korean regime from saying, "All right, guys, I feel like building nukes again"? Which, again, I mean, they've been building up for this so much so that the Kim regime has been willing to let its people live in poverty and under sanctions just so they can reach their goal of nuclear weapons.
I think that's a worry that'll never go away. Are they actually going to do it? And how do you prevent them from going back? That's why this is so difficult. And I think that was also a big problem with the Iran deal, because even though we had gone down that avenue, you still see them doing ballistic missile research development. So not all parts of the deal were, answered. And so that'll always be the big problem of how do you verifiably do this?
Well, I
It
think
has to have some element
the
on the ground.
verifiable part, I think, is certainly. I think actually it's going to be the trickiest part, and what concerns me.
Oh, yeah.
What concerns me about the summit is that it has not even been closely talked about. Now there has
In terms
been,
of what?
well, there hasn't been any leeway to show how it could possibly happen. I mean, take into account that North Korea is extremely secretive. It's not like we can just take a plane and fly there, and they're very closely guarded. Now there are promising signs. I read yesterday Japan's offered to be the verifiers, and that
They
would
hate
certainly.
the Japanese, though, because of history.
Well, I mean,
But
I
yeah,
think
it could happen.
I
It could
would
happen.
feel most comfortable with us verifying whatever that means, that we actually are the ones doing the verifying. If the North Koreans negotiate in good faith and we're doing everything in good faith, we should be the ones checking it out and not having a third party. But I want to go back to one thing that
go ahead.
Stephan said earlier is, well, the scientists aren't going to forget the science. And, this isn't exactly the same. I get that. But in my old life, I used to make pizzas and I used to sell pizzas. And no matter what, I'll always know that. But it doesn't mean that I'll always have the means or the equipment and I understand that they can do it in private, but if they go away from being this secretive hermit, if they just go away from that and they are re-immersed into the global economy and immersed into the global economy, they wouldn't necessarily have a need to do that. So although sure, there may be some people there that know how to do it, and if they did want to mobilize a movement to start it, they probably could. But so could every other country. So I don't think it's them having the knowledge is such a big deal. I think if we're taking something away from them, they got to the truest thing that we said is they used this to get to the table, and that's the truth. So once they're at the table, now we have to be able to give them something that is going to keep them at the table and away from doing those things. And North Korea being successful, I know the Kim regime is not a good regime, obviously, and
of course.
we can speak about that later, but North Korea being successful isn't necessarily a bad thing for the world. I think it's actually a better thing for the world. So it doesn't, just because they've gone down this road, maybe it was a tool, maybe they never will give it up. I'm not saying they will for sure, but I don't necessarily think just because they have the knowledge or that it can't be done just because it hasn't happened. Now, I think this was the first step, though. But again, I agree that there's we definitely need follow-ups and things need to happen verifiably, and we need to be the ones. Like, I wouldn't really be happy if there's other countries. We should be the ones doing it if we're going to have this great relationship and normalize relations with them.
Stefan, do you see, normalization of the North Korea into the global economy as being a possibility?
If it's going to happen, it's certainly going to be tough. And that's not to say that there are people. Now, let's be clear. There certainly are people that want to happen. And there's one thing that I've been disappointed about in terms of the U.S. media. It's been the lack of focus on how this is perceived outside the U.S. Before this podcast, I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to comb the internet to find articles on this. And it was very tough. For example, do you guys know?
What were you looking for in particular?
How do you guys think the South Koreans
Feel about
feel about this?
I would think.
I
they're
mean, my
scared.
belief is that they must be happy because think of how many thousands of pieces of artillery and missiles have been pointed at them as they go about their daily lives. So, I mean, my gut feeling is that going towards peace is a good thing. Now, are they maybe afraid of possible unification? Absolutely.
I would be.
Well, this is where it's going to be.
I don't even know if they can unify.
So this is where it's interesting. Actually, what I found was, and it was hard to find, not a lot of people reporting on this, but what I found was, did you guys actually know that the South Korean president actually ran on a platform of unification with North Korea?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Was there anything?
Not only that, but polls have been run showing that they see the summit
Was there
as
any
a
specifics
success.
of how the unification would work? Like who would be the ruler, or not really?
No.
It's just more of an idea.
Not that I could find.
Could it work the way it did in Germany, for example? Haven't they just been split for too long? I mean, I don't really know enough about Korean history and really the governments, but it just seems that they've been split for so long, isn't it? 70 years that now it's not a 20-year thing where you may still have family members and there may not be. I don't know. Let's just get the nukes off the island, off the peninsula before anything else.
I think the main difference between that and what happened in Germany is I'm not sure that the East Berliners were ever so vastly brainwashed as the North Koreans have been. They probably were to a certain extent, but probably not nearly as crazy as it is in North Korea.
Well, not only that, but I mean, there were portals to both sides. I mean, as Anthony, as you brought up, I mean, like this has been decades and decades where some people just haven't even seen the other side. With East and West Berlin, I mean, they had memories. And not only that, but
I guess it was right in front of their faces.
CIA had a great campaign to get past the Iron Curtain, as they called it, to educate people on the benefits of capitalism and democracy. So people knew. So it was easier for them to unify. But
if you don't have bread on your table, then you also kind of know as well.
Yeah, I mean that's a good point because I'm certainly no expert on the fall of the Soviet Union, but there is. I would have to believe that the unification was made easier with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fact that they were basically starved out, that they were drained. I mean, if you guys look at the actual strategy that was done by I guess you can call them the Western powers, really the fall of the Soviet Union is because all the countries worked together to basically stop the Soviet Union and their satellite states from having access to the major centers of industry all around the world. I mean, we worked with China, we worked with Japan.
And then also, wouldn't you say a big
England.
part of it was that they, in a way, forced the Soviet Union to spend so much of its resources on military?
Not just military, but they forced themselves to basically, because what they realized, there was, it's killing me that I don't remember this right now.
That could be a similarity to what's happening in North Korea if you make this guy spend endless sums of money on his military.
Yes,
but he already has, hasn't he?
It's not just the military, but it's basically, it comes down to convincing the regime that it's in their best interest to change their ways,
Yep.
to change their primary focus, because that's what they realized with the Soviet Union. They realized that, especially with the history of Russia, where for the Soviet Union, the Russians, they actually saw Soviet expansion as a form of defense for themselves, because they had seen so much history of
It was to make the buffer states.
yeah, they saw such a history of Europeans coming and trying to take over their lands. So for
Let's
them,
try to track back
yeah,
that a little
the
bit.
reason I bring that forward is, that was embedded in the, I guess you can call it, the toughness and the resilience of the Soviet state, and that has kind of inspired, because I mean, North Korea, it was in a division in the post-war. North Korea was was basically annexed by the Soviet Union, and that spirit has kind of stayed within them. So as we continue to starve them out, I don't know. I mean, they've done it for so long. The question comes, and this is where we come full circle, where you were asking, Anthony, is unification possible? It all comes down to, is Kim comfortable not being the supreme leader anymore? And I would point to looking at one of, I'm part Colombian, looking at the FARC as possibly, maybe something similar to that, where maybe if he just wants to make sure that his family's secure. I mean, again, we don't know anything about them.
Well, one way that... Oh.
No, go ahead.
I'll let you go next. One way that they were able to communicate with the FARC was that, they were sending letters down the river, and they had this whole basket campaign where they were sending letters, from old family members. And so I think the main way in that it compares to North Korea is you have to have some form of communication with the people, because that's what they've been able to do with FARC a bit, with the people in it who miss their families. And so if we are to bring back North and South Korea, I think there has to be some talk with regular, everyday people, but it doesn't seem like a possibility now. What did you want to mention?
Well, obviously, that's after the summit and they completely denuclearized. That's the major goal, right?
That's true.
But one of the things that you were saying earlier, Stephan, and I kind of noticed it twice, and I just want to make sure that I understand, because I want to see where your thoughts are. You said something about the Soviet Union and how so many different countries were involved in that. And I think you earlier, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but earlier you may have alluded to that. How does the rest of the world perceive this? And maybe that the rest of the world may not necessarily be completely on board the way they were before. So is that what you meant? Like, what do you mean by that? Do we even really need all of these countries to be on board? Because I'm of the belief that they need to be on board with us. If I'm the U.S. president, that's just the way I want my president to govern. So I don't really care what they think. So I think that's a fair thing to talk about, especially with this, because it's not just U.S. and North Korea. There's so many other factors involved here.
You're absolutely right. The thing about international relations is that it is, I believe it was Joseph Nye. He's a Harvard scholar. He once said, it's basically like 3D chess. And that means that it is incredibly multifaceted. It's not your standard deal where you're just sitting one person across the table. We can certainly have a different conversation. I have many different strong beliefs on Trump. But it isn't a zero-sum game. So I do think that we are going to have to work with our allies on this to make it a possibility. We are going to have to coordinate them if we're gonna do a carrot and stick kind of thing, especially the carrot. We are going to need to work with our allies to give them the full carrot. If we're especially look at economic wise, if we are to incentivize North Korea to say, hey, turn your back on your goals, for the past 25 years, to integrate with our global economy, we are going to need the full backing of the global economy. Yep. Yes, the U.S. is the backbone of that economy, but we still need the rest. Now, I'm going to transition that to an interesting question, which is the role of, some people will call them our frenemy, China. I would actually like to talk a lot about China's role in all of this. I would put out there that I think that China is the one at the driver's seat behind this whole thing.
Well, they're the ones keeping North Korea alive. If North Korea didn't have China,
They'd be done.
they would have no resources, no money, because North Korea doesn't have very many natural resources besides wood, lumber. So they have a lot of interest in it. And I think for a long time, they've been happy that North Korea has been the sore thumb at the Americans, causing the Americans problems, making us waste our money. So it's been good for them. It's hard to see, why they would want to de-escalate tensions, but perhaps, peace is something that would
Why
help.
wouldn't they though?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't they want to de-escalate tensions?
I think they finally do now.
So they have. I'd like to guide us, because I do think we can find an answer to that question. The first thing is like Ross, you are completely correct. They do have a very strong history. I mean, if you guys remember the Korean War, it was China that ultimately came in and stopped the U.S. advancement, and they brought it to the no man's zone.
Yeah.
Since then, they've really kind of been the political and economic backer of
No doubt.
North Korea. They're
No
the
doubt.
one. They've kind of been that safety line, kind of the IV, kind of just keeping them going. But at the same time, they've crossed a very, very fine line. You include strains, because they have been strained. I mean, the Chinese government. They are practical. They are very practical, and they haven't really been very cool with the fact that North Korea has been testing these nukes. When you look in 2006, where Beijing actually supported a UN Security Council resolution number 1718 that imposed sanctions. Now, what I would have to say into looking why they are interested in having this is I see China as having a very clear goal in terms of they want to have a bigger presence in the international community. I think that they see a space where they can become the hegemon of the international community, where the community will look to them as a de facto leader.
I don't see the exact tie with how you're tying that to the whole North Korea thing. Could you explain that a little bit more?
I can certainly get it there. So, for the first thing to realize is you have to look at the fact that China has greatly expanded what has been called soft power.
Mm-hmm.
Soft power is basically using goodwill to convince another country that your goals are in fact aligned with their goals.
Okay.
So China has been doing this through a multi-trillion-dollar project called the Belt and Road Initiative, where they've actually spent trillions of dollars in 67 countries. I'm talking major infrastructure
they're building
projects.
all of Africa.
Yeah, and they're trying to build a railroad in Colombia. They're trying to build a competitor to the Panama Canal in
It's probably
Nicaragua.
all of our money.
I mean, this is it's basically the Marshall Plan
Yeah, I know.
on like mega steroids. So they're building all this goodwill. At the same time, they're seeing kind of the tension that President Trump has built with some of our allies. He sees tension building. He sees that some like people like Merkel and Macron and Trudeau, that they're, I guess you could say, disappointed with Trump. They don't really see eye to eye with him. So what I see is China coming and saying, whoa, maybe we can come in and offer an alternative to the United States, change the status quo. And they've done this not just politically, not just money-wise, but actually they're actually looking. They're trying to establish their own development bank, where ultimately they would love for more people, more countries to turn to China, to their currency.
But how does solving the North Korean problem?
So North Korea, what does that do? Well, that on a very micro scale, that helps them solidify their positioning in the Southeast Asia region. So, for example, you look at the TPP, which was seen as a failure by President Trump because of the trade aspects. But what a lot of people don't think about is the international relations aspect of that, which was that deal in itself was a way to isolate China in the Southeast Asia region. If you look at all the participants in the TPP, it was everyone surrounding China except China. And what happened the day after President Trump cut the deal? China made its own TPP with all those same countries. So China's looking to establish stability. It doesn't want a rogue North Korea. You've seen that with the UN sanctions that it's been in support of. You've seen that in how it's cooperated with the US. It's trying to show like, hey, you guys can look to us as a leader. And I think there are evidence, like there's clear signs if you know where to look. Because yes,
I don't
China's
see
not
them
in
leading from a front on this.
Yeah, they're not in this, but that's the thing. They're not in the spotlight. But if you look at the timetable, you can see how they've had an impact. I mean, it's not surprising.
Did go on the train there first.
It's not surprising that Kim Jong-un speaks to China. Then they announce the Olympics, how they're marching together. Then he speaks to China again. All of a sudden, now they're talking about a summit, and then you look at the same time. I think it's been really curious to see let's not call it trade war, but the trade war between U.S. and China, because I've seen an inverse relationship. I've seen an inverse relationship between how talks with North Korea start to go well, and then the trade war kind of de-escalates. ZTE is a great example.
So Anthony, do you see China as being the real ones who are pulling the strings? Or do you think Kim Jong-un, is the main perpetrator?
I think from that part of the region, obviously in the region, China is the main player. But in these specific talks, I think it more has to do with the U.S. and North Korea. But I think Stephan's right in certain ways. They go there, they speak to China. It's kind of like they run things through China in certain ways. So if China didn't want North Korea to do the deal, would there be a deal? Probably not. But why wouldn't China want a deal? I don't. China doing well and China doing good things, I don't know if it's necessarily bad for the U.S. It just means we have more competition and we just have to get better.
And I mean, Stephan's not going to like this comment, but it's less money we got to waste on building every other freaking country except our own. Let them spend their money on it.
I mean, and we spoke about all this goodwill that China's building. What about all the goodwill that we've built? Is it really gone because of one president that some people hate and some people love? Isn't that the case for every president? I would say we're more polarized now, kind of within the country, but when we compare to Obama, but isn't every president someone who certain people hate and certain people love? So the goodwill, I don't think our goodwill is necessarily just null and void because of Trump. I don't see it all the way. I obviously think China's important especially because it's like if the Bahamas was doing a deal with China, we're here, right? I mean, obviously Bahamas is not a great comparison, but you know what I mean. We're here, so they're our next door neighbors. So this is going to come down to really whether the North Koreans want the deal or not. I believe that Trump is going to deliver on everything he's saying he's going to deliver on in terms of his promises. Now it's are you going to are you going to be verifiable? Are you going to do it in a timely fashion? If there was anybody that I would trust, in this situation, it would be Trump. I mean, if they didn't do the right thing, I don't think Trump cares about the political consequences of them not doing the right thing. He'll just blame them. Mm-hmm. Like that's the one thing that I guess gives me solace with Trump. That at least if he truly believes, if he feels slighted in the least bit, he'll walk out a deal. Now, obviously, that might not be the great thing all the time because we don't want a rash person in there. But if they're truly not holding up their end of the bargain, I just think Trump's that type of guy. He doesn't care.
Well, I'd like to ask a question on that, because, well, I mean, let's start talking about Trump's personality, which I think is very important to consider, in terms of making sure this thing is carried out through. Let's assume that my theory on China is correct, which, I mean, I would also present as further as evidence the fact that it was not the U.S., it was not North Korea that really made the official announcement. It was China, a diplomat, that really presented the end of the war games to the world, as further evidence to the fact to show that China's in the driver's seat. But let's say that, assuming that China is indeed in the driver's seat, Trump is a guy who he likes himself.
Yeah.
He likes himself, and that's putting it lightly.
That's a lot lighter than I expected to hear from you.
Well, that's a topic for another podcast. But certainly he was invigorated when the president of South Korea talked about the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think like if China's looking to get, if this theory is correct, if they're looking to get some credibility, they're certainly going to push back the idea that Trump was the mastermind of all this.
Mm-hmm.
I have to wonder,
Then how
is
come
he
it hasn't
willing?
happened? Or
China is very...
They're quiet.
They are, no, not just are they quiet, but they are very calculating. I mean,
Yeah.
if you actually look at how China creates their
Russians.
policy, they actually they plan their policy 5 years in advance. I don't
Yeah,
know if you
5
guys know
years.
that. Every 5 years
They're
they
so
meet.
smart.
I mean, there's a reason why, if there's one thing,
Japanese.
like
They
you
don't have
guys,
democracy.
you guys know I'm not a big fan of Trump, but if there's one thing that he is correct on, he is correct in the fact that China has been cheating, that they've been beating us, that they've been better than us. And I'll tell you why. There is a reason to that, and that's because they sit down and they think about the long term. And that is something that we do not really do in our United States political system. We like to think short term, we like to think right now, and we don't think consequences or
Yep.
not even
Is
And
that
I think the
benefits.
consequences
reason
of the
why
system?
is because they're always worried about the elections of tomorrow, whereas in China they don't have to worry about an election.
Mhm.
And they don't have democracy. I mean, democracy was implemented to give us gridlock essentially.
Yeah.
Look at the immigration debate. That obviously that's another podcast, but
Yeah, that'll be the next one.
Instead of having this 1,000-page comprehensive bill, why not vote on one thing, one provision? It's just the way the system's set up, how polarized everybody is. It's just in China they don't have that. They remain in power. Everybody knows to fall in line, and that's just what it is. So, obviously in certain things they'll be able to move a little quicker than us. But I think our system, the way we govern the people of this country are the difference. Now, again, is America the best is a whole nother podcast also, right? But with the way we've done things, we have made some mistakes with North Korea. Maybe this might be a mistake, but I don't see why we shouldn't be optimistic. I don't see why we should have the outlook that this is never going to happen. Does Kim really want just nothing in his country?
I know certainly most people didn't see this summit ever coming. I mean, did you a
So-
year ago?
Certainly a year ago, no. Although I would
6
not,
months ago.
I would not
Yeah.
put that. I mean, I don't know if I would put that as a benefit to President Trump, considering that
Uh-huh.
my pessimism a year ago was from his own making. I mean, seeing tweets of Rocket Man certainly did
I
not
actually think-
inspire me.
Yeah.
Inspired me. Honestly, I think that was
well,
good.
Let's look at that. Did it inspire you or did it entertain you?
Well, I used the word
Combination.
inspire because that was the word that you said, but I thought that there was going to be that was something different. That was something they hadn't dealt with. So there's a fine line on, is this guy serious? Is he just is this info? Is this just entertainment? So yeah, I guess I would say he's the most entertaining president ever. I think, right? But
Yeah.
but that specifically, that approach, that he has this hardline approach. He has this approach where if he's your enemy and you're his enemy, he's your bitter enemy, and I just think that show of force was important. I really do. I
Yep.
really do.
Because I think in the past couple times we've come down this road, this stance has been too easy. I think with President Obama and the Iran deal, sending them money on overnight flights
Forget
and
it.
unfreezing things. And these were things that happened before the deal was finally signed. This is like to get them to sign the deal. And I think you have to be really stern and firm until that deal gets signed. And maybe too many concessions have been given in the past.
I mean, I would disagree with that. I happen to be a supporter of the Iran deal, especially when you look at how difficult it really is to get a country to act against its own self-interest,
Yep.
to really create that fundamental change.
For Iran, it was money, yeah.
I mean, it's a huge accomplishment, and it really shows the need of international cooperation to achieve that. A lot of people don't recognize that the Iran deal was a multi-country agreement. It was not just the U.S. And if you look at the reception of the deal outside of the U.S.,
Would that be
been-
like the goal deal for you for North Korea? Or something a little
I
different?
mean, wasn't Iran deal? Didn't have a timetable. Wasn't it going to expire at some point? So how was that
Basically-
deal not just a Band-Aid?
well,
Yeah, would that be like your goal deal?
I would see it as certainly a good. Okay, well, first let me just answer. Ross, I'll answer yours, and then Anthony, I'll answer yours. You guys are got me sandwiched in between here.
You're having fun.
So basically, the Iran deal can certainly be it certainly could be a model to work forward from. The thing is, everything, like every situation is different. I work very closely in law, and everybody, like the number one rule in law is you never give an answer until you've examined all the facts. So if somebody comes to you and says, hey, Stephan, am I going to get off this crime? I've been arrested. I'll say, well, okay, I need to know the facts. And just because I've represented somebody, also, like, let's say if it's burglary, if I represent somebody of burglary and you also have a burglary, that doesn't mean that it's the same situation. Of course, I can
That's a really good point.
I can draw on some of the past aspects, legal cases, facts. I can draw on those, but it's all going to be very different. So I do think we do need to be careful in terms of really cookie cutting solutions. This is a very unique situation that we're in, and it really all just comes down to something that Anthony, that you brought up much earlier in the podcast. It's just way too early to know what's going on, and there are so many wild cards. I mean, Trump, he can change his mind.
I think it's different from Iran, but it's also the same in some ways. I mean, the situation in the Asian Pacific Rim is one of the most complex that's ever been dealt with in terms of China and all the different territories. But in a way, it's kind of similar, where in Iran, it's a theocracy. It's all confounded upon religion. But in North Korea, Kim Jong-un is their god. And so some of the similarities with the people and the rogueness and the way it's polarized and isolated, yet so loud and, obtrusive, is kind of similar. But they're definitely different.
What's interesting about the isolation, I told a friend of mine that we were meeting for this podcast, and he actually sent me an interesting article. This is from the BBC. North Korean propaganda changes its tune, and what this article was explaining was how over the past few months, they've basically, because keep in mind, I mean, as you said, Kim Jong-un is the god, and everything, that's the only form of media there is. There is no opposition media or anything. So they've had a very anti-American stance. But what's interesting is, according to this article from the BBC, that they've been replacing this propaganda for pro-American and inter-Korean reapproachment.
Really?
Yeah.
Isn't that a sign that they've come to the table with a legitimate. I don't want to use the wrong word, but they're in good faith.
In good faith, yes.
Right?
Sincerity of
right?
wanting
Legitimate
to-
sincerity,
Goodwill.
and I wanted to speak about two things. And the first thing is and maybe we can do this towards the end. But what would the ultimate deal be for the podcast? Well, excuse me, right? What would the ultimate deal be? No, but what would the ultimate deal be? Like, what is something that Republicans, Democrats, everybody can agree on that, hey, this is the right thing. And then the next thing is, which I think we should get to before that one, is how do we feel about the president? And forget about if we're a fan of Trump and all of that other stuff.
Yep.
How do we feel about the president cozying up with the dictator? I mean, that was unsettling. I didn't. Although yes, I support Trump in this, and of course I want him to succeed. And there are people out there that just don't want him to succeed on anything he does. But I want this to go well. But before the deal is done, you go and you put our flag next to their flag, and what the state has done to people, that was disquieting. That wasn't. It made me feel.
Stephan, if you want to answer the first one, and then I'll address the second question.
I mean, there are a number of things I would like to discuss with that. I certainly would like to talk about the point you made about the dictator part. There are a number of conversation points to that. What I find interesting, I mean, because there are so many different things with this issue, with North Korea. I mean, one, there's a sincerity because, I mean, the playbook at its core is still the same, and that's what has me. Like Anthony, you're looking at optimism, and you advocate to have optimism in this. I agree. Optimism is it's something that's great. I certainly I do not want us to go to war. Nobody wants that, but at the same time, I think we need to stay grounded in reality. And we need to, while we can hope that everything works out, we need to recognize where we are today and where we've been up to this point. For example,
It's a little vague.
But how do you feel about the imagery of the president standing there next to a dictator? One of my favorite pundits is Ben Shapiro, and he compared putting the U.S. flag next to a Nazi flag. How would we all feel about that?
Listen,
Okay,
the same thing had happened, with the Soviet Union when Nixon met with China. Nobody's, ever going to say that these countries, aren't very bad actors, that they haven't done really terrible things. But when the escalation and the stakes are so high of nuclear war, of, our crazy artillery on Seoul, when the stakes are so high, I don't think we have another choice. And it's not easy to put our flags with them. It's not easy to stand with these guys because a lot of them are really terrible. But the avenue is a good one, I think, for peace.
It's a good means to an end, maybe.
Well,
Yeah.
to this point, okay. Maybe I should at this point I'd like to give you guys, especially you, Ross, a trigger warning here. But part of me can't help but think back to, again, here's another trigger warning.
about Obama.
Maybe Obama.
I know. Yeah, I
Yes,
know. But Cuba?
Yeah, Cuba. I can't help but think back to Cuba. I mean, in hearing criticism of
It's a fair point.
of President Trump for putting the American flag next to the North Korean flag, I mean, part of me. I mean, first let me be clear
Urgency.
here. Let me be clear here, because I see Anthony shaking his head here. I'm always a fan of diplomacy, so I'm always of the belief that the effort should be made to find a diplomatic solution to whether they're, whoever they are. They could be Wile E. Coyote and, the Roadrunner guy. Let's make peace. I mean, that's always great instead of blowing each other up. But what I have found interesting is sort of the hypocrisy from the hardliners. There was an interesting video clip. I think it was from The Daily Show, where they kind of. It was kind of like it was Hannity versus Hannity.
Yeah, I saw it on Facebook.
Yeah, and it's like you had Hannity kind of criticizing the exact same thing that Trump was doing. When and you compare that. I mean, Obama when he was sitting there eating a hot dog with Raul Castro in Cuba.
So, Anthony, what do you think the difference is?
I think the difference is the urgency of North Korea needs to get done. I mean they have nukes there. This idea that Cuba and I'm not necessarily a person that says we shouldn't speak with Cuba. I don't necessarily agree with the right on that, but the idea that these two countries are comparable is not, in some ways yes, but overall no. These people have nukes. They're pointing them at us. They're pointing them at Seoul. They shot a missile into space that could potentially reach anywhere on U.S. soil. I mean,
well, not necessarily. Actually, let's look at what's actually capable. North Korea, they shot a missile up into space, but if you actually look at the actual science of delivering a warhead, just because they got into space, that's actually the easy part. The hardest part is actually the re-entry into the atmosphere. Not only that, but actually getting it small enough, because that's the final hurdle that North Korea has.
The thing that's
scary
though is you're talking about the final step.
Yeah,
there's that.
I mean, what does Cuba? What kind of weapons does Cuba have that are going to scare us? I mean,
cigars.
You're right.
Right. I mean,
and that's why we should that's why we should normalize relations.
But
with them.
I mean, that goes to the point. So, like Anthony, I just want to make sure I am interpreting what you're saying clearly. Are you saying that Obama should not have put in the effort to reach out to Cuba?
No, on Cuba specifically, I don't disagree with us normalizing relations with them. Although there are a lot of people that do disagree in their communist country, I don't necessarily disagree with that. What I'm saying is they're not comparable in the way that Trump needs to get something done with North Korea more than we need something done with Cuba. If we were, they're just, you can't.
But in the context,
you can't compare the urgency of one country has a nuke, has threatened to hit anywhere in the U.S., and another country, we're just not friends with them. It doesn't. I don't see how you can compare how urgent we need North Korea compared to Cuba.
Well, but that what the point I'm getting at though is that in terms of the specific criticism of a U.S. president standing, shaking hands with, and mixing flags with a dictator, because that's a specific criticism being made by people like Hannity, or now being made by some of the people on the left. I think Rachel Maddow had criticism of that with Trump standing, putting the flags right next to the North Korean ones. I mean, there's the hypocritical criticism of that specific point of the same people applauding one president for doing one thing and then criticizing the next president for doing the exact same thing while flip-flopping, while doing the opposite.
You certainly have a fair point. It's all about in terms of what are the priorities. Is our number one priority not doing business or not doing any deals with people who have bad human rights? Is human rights the number one priority? Is preventing, nuclear proliferation the number one priority? So it's hard to choose.
Ross, but we have to always remember that the flag represents a big something great. It's us and it's important. And we spoke. I don't want to speak about our text messages outside of the podcast, but we spoke about how important it is for the people in charge to uphold some professionalism and to but seriously to really
absolutely.
And we shouldn't lose sight of it. All I'm saying is, I would have done it also if I was Trump, but I would have known that this isn't a great look. That I'm not a fan of seeing our flag next to their flag.
Yep.
Just based on what the Kim regime has done, and I think the regime in the 25 years, it's been pretty simple. We need to get nukes if we're going to survive. Otherwise, eventually, we're not going to survive. And now they have a nuke.
They've even sacrificed their people.
And they've shown that they don't care. Now they have a nuke, and now this is their way to survive. Because I think they're smart enough to know if they ever used it, they would get it from all over. So maybe this was what they needed to solidify their power. And who knows? Maybe the Kim family will remain in perpetuity, will remain in charge of perpetuity, and that will be it. And maybe their goal will be paid off. And from a realism point of view, that was a smart move on their part to remain in power. But we shouldn't forget who they are. But I do agree that it needed to happen. I just kind of wanted to bring it up because that was a talking point. And I just think it's important to think about that.
Well, I think what I find interesting, because, I mean, you're right, but I'm not sure if President Trump is even thinking at that level. Because I see him, like when I looked at that video that, for example, that he showed at the summit, like some people called it propaganda, almost propagandist, but it makes me wonder. I mean, if like I have to wonder, like if I were in that situation, would I have made such a video where I'm presenting this beautiful North Korean country and idolizing the regime? It's I understand where he's coming from. Like that's how what you do in business, especially in real estate. That's how the business works. That's where Trump comes from. But there's a certain sensitivity that you need to partake in that, Anthony, you were referring to, where you can work towards peace, but at the same time, in the back, without insulting the other party, saying like, hey, like,
some rough guys,
like you gotta do it. But at the same time, though, I mean, you look at the history of the United States. Earlier, Anthony, you mentioned the fact of like you kind of were alluding to the fact, that the world looks to the U.S. as like almost kind of like a city on the hill kind of thing. The point you were making was like, do they see China the same way? But I would actually, I mean, if you look at the actual way of history, I mean, we've done some really shady things.
Yeah.
I mean, especially like, I have roots in Colombia. I've looked at what we've done in Latin America, our support of dictators, especially in that region.
Thinking of Panama.
Panama. There's Jamaica. There's a huge history where I mean, there's that mantra that we've all heard. He may be an asshole, but hey, at least he's my asshole. And that's how the U.S. policy is really. Thank you for that.
I mean, he's on our side. I have roots in Italy, and the U.S. came in World War II and fought this fight in Russia, and the U.S. hasn't only been bad. That I guess that's the point I want to make. Of course, we're
not as good as we like to believe we are.
You're right. We're better. We're better. We are better.
Go to Guatemala and see how they think of that. Especially
everybody hates you when you're number one, man. That's just what it is. And
when this is a North Korean podcast, I mean, I guess we got to quote the interview. James Franco saying they ain't us because they hate us.
Right.
One type of role I could see, the Kim family having if there was denuclearization and a possible unification would to kind of be like the Emperor of Japan. Whereas after World War II, they knew how central the emperor was to the people. So they thought, let's keep this guy in power. He's not actually going to have control over anything. They're going to establish their own government. But him and his family and his lineage will always be safe. So that could kind of be, a goal of what to accomplish in North Korea. And that was also a place where, they were quite possibly the worst human rights abusers of all time, the Emperor of Japan, or the Imperial Japan. And the decades since, we've become such close allies. They've really become a wonderful country. So, opening relations while still letting that lineage be in power in some type of back role could be possible.
I'm curious,
but we did have to destroy them to get there.
I'm curious though, in this beautifully Monet-inspired painting that you're
It's hard to
laying in front
compare
of
because
us.
we had to destroy them
is this
first, I
is
know.
this a unified Korea, or is North Korea separate? Because I mean, while that
don't
could
know.
work
That's up to
on
the
a separate
Koreans.
North Korean,
Yeah, it's
there's
up to
no way a South Korean would.
Well, maybe
would
they
do
could.
that.
Maybe they could be the
Possibly.
family of the North while they. But I guess that's up to.
but if-
that's not.
if
That
we've
shouldn't
all
even really be
seen-
our. We should be there for them if this actually happens and they denuclearize and we normalize, and then the next question is, are they going to unify? We shouldn't even be in. I wouldn't say we shouldn't be in the room, but that's kind of like when a husband and wife or a brother and a sister or two siblings are hashing it out. That needs to be between them and whatever works for them. And if that means the North Korean regime has, I love that idea actually that you said,
Yeah.
kind of comparing it to Japan.
It's the first time I thought of it.
You know, that's maybe that's a compromise. And it's not the best compromise. It's not the compromise that everybody wants, obviously. But guess what? If this is going to give this country a chance to jolt itself into the future and it just have the opposite of the last century of famine and isolation, and have the opposite, and who knows, maybe they can become like a Japan one day. Who knows? I mean, who really knows? They've just been isolated from the world. They don't even know that. I think there's certain articles out there with people saying that once they left North Korea, they didn't really realize how what the world was. So who knows what potential this group of people have,
So with that, and as we're coming upon our final thoughts, Stephan, where do you see us going? What's the next step? In your opinion, what do we have to do to make this thing work?
Okay, well, the first thing, just to kind of tie in what Anthony said to where we're going, I don't know if Warden of North would work. I mean, we've all seen Game of Thrones,
Yeah, right.
and did not end so well to the Starks. So the Kims, I think if they, I don't
love that
think they would.
comparison.
I don't think
love
they'd be
that.
too
What do we have
happy
to do to make this work?
to make this work. Number one, it is of the utmost importance that we stay realistic. We stay realistic, and we move cautiously, but proactively. And this is going to require, I believe, a lot of restraint from President Trump, because I see him as a big potential problem as we move forward. I understand the domestic political emphasis that or view that he's looking at this from. He's energizing his base, looking strong. That's just how he is. But I've been concerned with the message that he's been sending, especially on Twitter, where he believes, like if we were to present some of the things we've talked about on this podcast with the message that he's been sending, it would be starkly different, because the messages he's sending is that it's already been won. And I think that it's very dangerous, because if we're already one, I mean, it's completely contrary to what he writes in Art of the Deal. You don't claim a victory when you do it. Not only that, but Sun Tzu also says, don't do that. So I think from a negotiating point, he is putting himself in danger of that by putting so much of the, like, if you're playing cards, putting too much in the pot when, you just got your first hand. That's definitely you have to be very cautious with that. But at the same time, he can be very, what's the word? Very volatile. We've seen how he can change his mind almost instantaneously, overnight. So one concern that I have is if Kim Jong-un, like, let's say if he does something to disrespect President Trump, even inadvertently, maybe he doesn't give him the full credit, or maybe he doesn't, maybe he disagrees with one aspect. President Trump can, like, we've seen him completely go backwards, and I'm afraid that will get in the way.
He did that today, actually, with the immigration deal. There was two things going on, and two bills, and he just said, let's just wait till the red wave comes and let's just kick both of these things off. And one minute he agrees, he endorses it, the next minute he doesn't. But just to give you a little pushback on that, I don't necessarily think that's going to be an issue in this deal. I think the gravity of the situation. I mean, he went from calling him Rocket Man and tweeting that his button was bigger to this.
But that shows how easy it is for him to go from point A to point. I don't want to say point A to point B because that implies that that you can only go forward. You can also go backwards. But from going from one point to the next, he goes there very quickly, and that comes from his business background, where he likes to what's called smooze people, but it can go the other way with the immigration thing. And to give our listeners a quick sneak preview, our next episode will be on immigration.
Yep.
We'll have the wonderful addition of a board certified immigration attorney who will give a great perspective on everything that's happened in current events, as well as the policies. Yes,
I'm gonna have to be on my
it's
toes
very
for that.
nuanced. So we are very excited to have this. But we've seen, in terms of it's for Trump. It's interesting how he kind of presented that, like the rejection almost of the two bills. Where a lot of people on the right were saying, like, whoa, that's not really a strategically beneficial move. But he went ahead and he did it because Trump, he trusts his gut above anything else.
Yep.
And he, yes, that's. Some people say it's worked for him for his businesses, but this is not business. This is global politics. There are many, many, many different goals that everybody has, different priorities. Everybody's looking out for themselves, but at the same time, they need to give some give and take.
Any final thoughts, Anthony?
Ross, what do you? So what is a success look? What do you think a success looks like?
Well, it was one of the first times I thought of it, and it's a far-reaching goal. But I think the end goal would be to do something like what they did with Japan, where to make this guy and tell him that your security is guaranteed and your family's lineage, but you're going to take a step back from government, and we're going to start to normalize the people, maybe normalize economics. But I know it's far-fetched, but maybe years out with the weapons.
It's a 2-year
I think
goal.
we're taking it the right path because with Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton could have saved the world if he fixed some of these problems back in the 90s, but that's hindsight, so it's not totally fair to judge him. But with that and with the Iran deal, the main problem that I see and the main similarities is the concessions were given too soon. I don't think Trump is going to do that. I think he's going to argue from a standpoint of strength, and I see it as working out, but I choose to go with optimism.
So Ross, I'm curious. Do you see what happened at the summit as no concessions have been given? Ultimately, do you believe, because there have been some opinions put out there that a concession has already been given by letting him stand next to President Trump, the leader of the free world.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think in a way that is, but I think it was an important step, and they have given us some nice gestures back in terms of letting us have our dead troops back from the Korean War, as well as a few other things. I think that's a fair assessment, though. In a way, it was a concession. But I agree with that.
I don't think it's an ultimate.
I don't think it's bad. It's not as bad as giving him money on a
it's
private
certainly.
jet. But I get. You know what?
When you get down. Just like I bring it up just because we're comparing Iran to North Korea, which, as I said, they're both very unique. But I do think that we do need to be careful because if we give too much, in the beginning. There has to be a very fine balance between giving just enough to get them there, but not too much, while at the same time stating the opposite, saying like, "Oh no, like I'm being strong."
I think when you're working in good faith, that type of thinking hurts your deal. When you're working in the faith, I can't get. When both parties sit down and they really want a deal and they really want to negotiate. When I sold my business, we both wanted to make this deal, and it wasn't a perfect deal, but we wanted to get it done. And when you come to the table with that, and both sides are willing to have that, then maybe something good could happen. I mean, time will tell, but I just don't think that worrying about every little nuance is important. I think having a macro view and having the view that we got to get this deal done, and through time, hopefully we can normalize, and hopefully they can get out of poverty and make the world a better place.
Yeah.
And for everybody listening, please check us out on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. We'd love to hear your support, to hear your thoughts on what we're saying, some pushback, some agreement, any of it. We'd love to hear it all.
And
of
the
it.
username for
Definitely. And
for YouTube.
Well, yeah, our username for YouTube is Right on Campus, and our Facebook page is Right on Campus. So check us out.
Yep.
Well, in closing, I think I would love. Why don't we go one by one, all of us, and really just summarize what we've gotten out of this podcast. Anthony, do you want to go first?
The one thing I'm proud about the podcast is that I thought this podcast was going to become Trump centric, and it did, but appropriately, and it wasn't just a debate on Trump, because I think the way we start getting past all the issues is whether we stop debating on every little thing he does or says and just really start worrying about what the actual things are. And I think that's the way, because some of us here are on the right, some of us here on the left, or some of us here on the middle, who knows, right? But the point is that this is kind of how we should approach situations. So I'm actually very proud of it.
Stephan?
So as we look forward, I am very glad that we have given voice to a rational, that we've done a rational conversation on the issue. I think it's dangerous that we can sometimes get lost in the tribal aspects of where we stand, and we tend to roll back on them. I think the main lesson from North Korea as we look forward, and the main thing to think about as we continue to see how this unfolds, is we need to have cautious optimism. And it's essential that we stay rooted in the truth, and that we not just think about this from a U.S. perspective, but from an international perspective, and understand that North Korea has its own goals as well, and it's going through them in a very rational method. And I'm curious to see how this ends.
Yeah, I think finding the solution starts with conversations like these. It's so important to sit down with somebody from the opposite side and realize, hey, even if we disagree with each other, we all have the same end goal, and that's finding a solution and creating peace. Nobody wants to see us go to war, and while we differ in the means, the end goal is the same. And so when we work together, it can really be quite successful. And with that, I want to thank both of you for coming on.
Thank you to everyone listening.
Yep. Our next podcast should be coming up, hopefully in a week or so. And we really want to thank our listeners.
Thank you so much, everyone.
All right.